be grateful if everyone can just double check your mic is on mute and then no video is turned on. And later, please type your questions in the chat box and we can go through them at the end of Katrina's talk. So today our speaker is Katrina Rosenberger. Katrina is in her final year of her PhD at Agroscope in Switzerland on goats. So today she's going to talk about combining quantitative measurement and QBA to assess stress in goats. So over to you, Katrina.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Jen. Just short question, does everybody hear me? Does everybody see the full screen? I'm trying to make the screen full now.
Yes, we can hear you, and now, yeah.
Well, it seems to take a while. I can't even see my full screen yet.
Yes, we're also waiting.
Now, there it is. Do you see it?
Great. Yes, please.
Perfect. Thank you. So, good evening, everybody, again. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about some of my goat research to you. First, I want to introduce myself again. I'm Katrina, PhD student from the Vet Swiss Bern, but I'm, like Jen said, actually working at Agroscope within the Center of Proper Housing of Small Ruminants and Pigs. My main PhD focus is actually to investigate the effect of long-term cognitive testing on goat welfare. However, today I want to talk about the assessment of stress in goats. This is an important topic because although we know much about goat management and husbandry, we still lack validated stress indicators that can be used not only in lab, but also on farm. So first, in order to assess stress, we have to talk about what stress actually is. First of all, it is a biological response to a threat. But it is also an emotion or short-lived affective state, which is including a behavioral component, an autonomic component, and a subjective component. So this means that changes in stress levels can be detected in behavior, physiology, and emotional states. Whereas changes in behavior and physiology can be assessed using like resource-based and animal-based measures such as the number of feeders or drinkers, body condition scores, or behavior. The assessment of emotions is rather difficult because an emotion is a subjective state. It does not really possible to be directly assessed, and this makes it tricky. Especially farm animals, however, often face stressful situations, so this can all reduce their welfare. Hence, we need methods to assess stress. Different scientific research methods have been designed to assess stress in goats, or in general, actually, in animals. We can divide these methods in quantitative and qualitative methods to assess stress. Quantitative assessment is, like it says, the quantification of behavior. So it describes what is the animal or its body doing. It can be assessed using behavioral indicators, which are often the primary signs of distress, or physiological indicators. However, we can also describe the quality of behavior or how the animal is doing something. This method makes use, for example, of cognitive bias tests, but also of qualitative behavior assessment, or short QBA. So let's talk about quantitative assessment using behavior and physiology first. Quantitative assessment or using behavior is a lot of times making use of common stress tests. Most of you will have either used them, heard of them. So the common ones are open field, or also novel arena test, it's called, the novel object test, novel human test, back tests, just to name the most common. Common parameters that are assessed during these tests include defecation, locomotion, rearing, sniffing the ground, the distance to the walls, vocalizations, etc. Originally, however, these methods or tests have been developed to assess emotionality in laboratory rodents. This is also why these tests have to be used with caution when interpreting behavior. Rodent behavioral parameters indicative of emotionality may not be directly relevant to other species. The use of these tests is problematic due to several reasons. First, in these stress tests, differences in methodologies have been applied, such as different sized arenas, and thus their validity as well as their reliability cannot be guaranteed or compared to other studies easily. Second, sometimes many tests have been used to assess the same traits, and sometimes only one test is used to measure several traits. And last, not all have been validated for other species, making the interpretation of behavior very tricky. So let's talk about some of these problems in more detail. Just to give you an idea of the issues I mentioned, I will briefly explain two of the most common tests, the open field test and the novel object test. In the open field test, or also called novel arena test, the animal is introduced to an usually novel arena. The entry can be forced or free. In the novel object test, the individual is introduced to a novel object, and most of the times, the same arena is used, like in the novel arena test. So far, so good. But now look at the measured traits in this table. So the first problem that I mentioned was many tests to measure the same trait. For example, exploration here in green. As you can see, both the open field and the novel object test have been both used to measure exploration in different studies. But does exploration in a novel arena describe the same behavior as exploration towards a novel object? Many times no correlation of the two can be found. The second problem is the one of using one test to measure many traits. If differences in, for example, the methodology between studies occur, then it is possible that the open field test in one study measures exploration, whereas in a different study, where maybe entry is forced, it measures fear. However, even within the same study, one test can simultaneously be influenced by two or more traits. So sometimes different terms are used interchangeably, such as emotionality, fear, temperament, or even behavioral reactivity, although a lot of times they are meant to describe the same emotion or trait. So this can lead to confusion in the interpretation. So the next problem is the interpretation of the quantitative measures. Behavior shown during the tests might be difficult to interpret as it is species dependent. For example, the separation from social partners affects vocalizations and rearing differently in sheep and goats. But even within a species, breed differences can occur and have been shown. So sheep breeds have been found to differ in the number of vocalizations and activity in an open field test. Or broiler breeds differ in their emotional reactivity and inhibition in novel environment tests. But also in goat breeds, differences in the reactivity towards humans have been found. So you can already see that there is quite the range, even between different species and within breeds. To give you an idea of what I mean with breed dependency and difficulty of interpretation of behavior, here are the preliminary results from one of our experiments. In this study, we tested dairy and dwarf goats in a novel arena and a novel object test. The first graph shows the amount of rearing against the walls in the open field and novel object test combined, which you see here on the y-axis. We combined them because the two tests were highly correlated. As you can see, we found significant differences in the number of rearing between dairy and dwarf goats. Similarly, if you look at the number of vocalizations, again, we found the same pattern, a much higher number of vocalizations in the dairy goats. So what does this mean? Are they more sociable? Do they want to get out the dairies? Or are they actually less impaired by their fear? And that's why they are moving more and rearing more? But let's get to the next example, looking at the novel object test. So here we looked at the latency to contact the object. And again, you see big differences between the dairy goats and the dwarf goats. In the top video, you see a dairy goat approaching a traffic cone. And in the bottom video, you see a dwarf goat in the same arena approaching the same cone. And you see big differences. While the dairy goat is approaching the cone really fast, pretty much instantaneously, the dwarf goat takes much more time to look around, look at her environment, and then approaches the cone. So what about the interpretation of behavior in goats now? So very common parameters that have been mainly used in goats so far in these kind of tests are locomotor activity, vocalizations, rearing, sniffing, object contact, duration of this contact, and eliminative behavior. So what a lot of studies, or the few that tested it, found was that locomotor activity, vocalization, and rearing especially are more or less socially motivated behaviors. And they are even affected, or especially vocalizations are affected by the degree of isolation of the goats from their peers. Whereas with the other parameters, it's not so clear and they haven't really been validated yet in goats. However, especially object contact or any object-related parameters are usually related to exploration or higher boldness in at least other animals. Regarding the repeatability of tests, Österwind et al. Found that repeated OF testing, so open field tests, I think they did them 4 times, decreased the duration and latency to object contact, and rearing and segments crossed increased, and only vocalization and elimination was unaffected. So this would mean that actually the only repeatable parameters are vocalization and elimination. We are also at the point of analyzing our data that I just showed you and compare it to physiological recordings from ECG data to ease our interpretation. Hopefully after that, I'll know better. So now we get to look at quantitative assessment using physiology. To assess stress, it is important to also understand the neurophysiological processes underlying this emotional state. During stress activation of the sympathoadrenal-medullary system and the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, in turn, it leads to an increase in synthesis of catecholamines and glucocorticoids, but also to a change in the autonomic nervous system, which can be measured. Here I mention some common methods and parameters used to assess these physiological changes. I'm not going to detail though, as I just want to show that only a few have been linked with positive emotions and thus can be used as indicators of valence. You see them in yellow here, as opposed to only arousal, like in the other parameters in red. I want to focus on the last method, the cardiography via external monitors, so using heart rate variability as a stress measure, as this is the one that we use mainly in our studies, and it has been shown to be promising in goats also. So a little bit about cardiography. So it detects the level of activity of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and can be used as an indicator of an organism's general physiological state. Especially cardiac vagal tone can be used as index for stress during, for example, acute stress. The vagus rapidly withdraws, which results in reduced heart rate variability and increased heart rate. So heart rate and heart rate variability have been used as a non-invasive method to evaluate emotional states in farm animals. In goats, they have been, for example, used to assess the effect of cognitive challenges on goats, or to assess the effect of food anticipation with different valence. So how can we best measure stress using reliable indicators? One possibility is to combine different measures of physiology and behavior, such as salivary cortisol during open field tests. Another possibility might also be the use of multiple measurements for multiple traits and investigate if there is correlations among them. An example would be the correlation of open field novel human and novel object tests, like they did in sheep and found that parameters actually correlated highly. A more recent suggestion was made by Briefer et al., who tried to measure arousal as well as valence for all their parameters. By doing so, they found that in positive situations, goats have their ears backwards less often and their tail is more up. So looking into tail and ear positions may be a promising way. As you've learned from the previous slides, the assessment of affective states such as stress is challenging, but it is also a critical component of animal welfare research. So, according to the welfare quality framework, negative emotions such as fear, distress, frustration, or apathy should be avoided, whereas positive emotions such as security or contentment should be promoted. But in order to promote these rather, I'd say, anthropomorphic emotions, we have to find a way to measure them. A different technique which has the potential to help interpret specific measures of physical and psychological stress is called Qualitative Behavior Assessment, or QBA. QBA can be a useful addition to stress tests and help to cross-validate these, I think. QBA is a whole animal approach, and the underlying premise is that human observers can integrate perceived behavioral details about the animals and signals to judge an animal's behavioral expression by using qualitative descriptors, which are defined before, that reflect the animal's emotional state. QBA has been successfully used as a tool to assess welfare of many livestock species, especially in on-farm settings, because there is no restraint or intervention in the lives of animals with this method, so it's very useful for an on-farm tool. However, there is an ongoing debate whether and how QBA outcomes relate to behavioral and physiological parameters. Hence, more validation is definitely needed. Sorry, I totally jumped over that slide. Well, you heard it. Several studies to date have tried to scientifically validate QBA with behavioral and physiological measures. I will not go into detail here, don't worry, the list is exhaustive, but it shows that the methodology has been applied to assess animals on farm and during transport, both individually and at group level, with different livestock species such as pigs, horses, cattle, poultry, and sheep. QBA has also been shown to be reliable and repeatable and also correlated well with quantitative measures tested. So to sum this up, there is established quantitative methods to assess stress in goats, but very few parameters have been validated, such as vocalizations, which I mentioned before, and rearing against walls. ECG may be a promising tool as addition to behavioral measures to interpret arousal, but also valence better. So far, no clearly established indicators of emotional valence exist for goats. However, as Briefer et al. Showed, tail and ear positions seem to be promising. QBA has been used as indicator for many emotional states in goats, and QBA descriptors in goats are out there and have been found to correlate well to health parameters and stockmanship. So what's lacking? What we miss is the validation of quantitative stress indicators with ECG data in goats. Also, quantitative indicators from open field, novel object, and novel human test with these qualitative descriptors is missing. And the assessment of stress on an individual level, and maybe also more validation for dwarf goats, as most studies has been focusing on dairy goats. Based on our current knowledge and the gaps we still have to fill, we are currently actually running a small study which has been funded by UFAF. This study is using quantitative measures from standardized stress tests to validate qualitative descriptors and trying to fill this gap. In the course of this project, we make use of quantitative data from an open field, novel object, and novel human test, as well as ECG data taken during these tests. The data was collected from 30 Nigerian dwarf goats and 30 dairy goats at the Leibniz Institute for Farm Animal Biology in Germany, Dummersdorf. We are in the process to validate the quantitative measures obtained with qualitative descriptors and hope this will ease the interpretation of stress indicators and shed further light on possible indicators of positive emotions in goats. And with this, I want to thank you for your participation. But also, I want to thank my funders and all the people that were involved in these studies, especially Christian Nafroth, Nina Keil, and Jan Langbein, as well as Monica Battini, who is working with me on the last project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katrina. It's a very interesting talk. So now we can take some questions. So please type in your questions in the chat box. And you can raise your hand if you're just in the middle of the typing so that we can wait a bit for your question to come in. And while we're waiting, I have one or two questions. I wonder, so you talk about a lot of the behavior tests. Do you think that it's measuring more the chronic stress the animals are experiencing, or can some acute stress be also picked up in these behavior tests?
So your main question is if we can only see long-term stress or chronic stress or also acute stress, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it really depends on the measures you choose to combine, really. Like I said, if you choose measures that are validated for arousal and valence, it should be possible to find out if the animal is at a state of acute stress exactly when you're measuring, but then maybe you need to work, for example, with ECG data, because if you look at the HRV, so the heart rate variability, at exactly the time, for example, when the goat is having contact with the object, and you see changes there, then I'm sure you could assess just this time range. But then, of course, you always need baseline measures, so you have something to compare to within that individual. Of course, also to other individuals, but as HRV can go up and down a lot between individuals, it's really important to have a baseline measure for that individual. But yes, I definitely think that you can get an assessment of just a short time point. Also, actually with QBA also doesn't need a long recording. You can really just show somebody a 1 minute section and ask how the person would judge the goat's behavior. And you actually get pretty good correlations, and maybe that can give you a better feeling for if it was fear or exploration. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks very much. And now we have a question from Victor, and he asks, can everyone apply the QBA? How long does it take for someone to be trained to apply it?
Thank you for that question. That is actually a very important question, one that many people ask. Yes, everybody can be trained to do QBA scoring. It is not even really necessary that you have knowledge of the species. Of course, that's beneficial because that will make training definitely shorter. Because in the best case scenario, you really want somebody who has already worked with the species, so can interpret behavior anyways better. But really anybody can be trained, even just via videos. We are actually currently doing this with the current project because of the COVID-19 situation. We have to. We had to do it online. So we'll see how that goes. But yes, it's absolutely doable to do this online, and everybody can be trained. And how long it takes really depends on your previous education, but you can learn it really within a day if you study the descriptors that have been already defined for that species properly. This is the main yeah, the main thing. You have to know your descriptors, so you don't have to look at the list every time you score a video.
Thanks, Katrina. I can definitely vouch for you. I'm lucky to participate in your study, and I think you did a very nice training webinar to us. So yes, definitely looking forward to the results. And then now we have another question from Ocean. And she said, thank you very much for your talk. And did you give any thoughts about the subjectivity of the observer when using QBA? And some studies have found that the raters can be biased by the settings in which the animals is in, as well as by their own perception of the behavior. For example, if it's an inactive animal, bored because it has nothing to do, or happy because it's resting. So yes, so this is a question from Jose.
This is now related to QBA again, right? Not really
Yes.
to, yeah. Um, yes, exactly. This is one of the problems with QBA, where it is actually better to be trained by video or actually score videos, because you don't have so much information on the surroundings, and you only maybe see this one room where the animal is spending its time. But a lot of time what can happen is that observers go to a farm and the farm is in a really bad state, and although maybe the animals look fine, but just because it's dirty or everything is old and scruffy looking, the observer will be biased and bias that animal to look more stressed or whatever, more lame. But usually you get very good inter-observer reliability using QBA when you properly train the scoring personnel. That is our experience. That's what they found in the most recent papers. If you want to know more information on that, look at especially Monica Battini's papers. She did a lot of work on that. But or of course, Françoise Wemmersfelder, who actually started QBA. But inter-observer reliability is very high in the most recent studies. But it all depends on training.
Thanks, Katrina. So next question, I think we have a question from Yenny, if I'm right. So Yenny said that you mentioned some effects of repeated measuring in the stress test. Would you still recommend testing repeatedly? And do you have any proposal for the best age to test?
This is also a very good question. I actually had age dependency in my slides, but had to cut it out because it was too long. Yes, it really depends on the age of the animals, how they behave in the open field or novel arena, novel object test, because, for example, there's a nice study from Dependency on calves, which found that the younger the calves, of course, the more playful they are, the more they jump around. So this will affect behavior. And then, of course, if you do the test at a later time, you will not find the same results. Even within individuals, you will find big differences for certain behavioral traits. But yes, I would still definitely recommend to do stress tests, and I think they can help us a lot to find indicators for welfare in animals, or especially during stressful situations when isolated. Farm animals have to go through so many situations where they are isolated. So especially finding stress indicators during isolation, these tests can be very useful, because like I said, for one species, high vocalizations maybe mean they're sociable. For others, they are having fun, whatever. Then again, of course, it depends on the high pitch, low pitch. So there's different kinds of vocalizations. We shouldn't forget that. Very nice work by Elodie Briefer on that, also in goats. But yeah, no, I totally think that they are very useful methods, but we really have to combine them with physiology, with QBA. We cannot look or interpret vocalization or rearing against walls just by itself.
So Jenny also asked, do you have any proposal for the best age to test them?
Oh yeah, the best age, sorry, I forgot that. Again, I think this really depends on the species, but I don't think measuring at a too young age is telling us a lot about the animal, but it really depends on the study, right? If I want to know how prenatal stress affects goat kids, then of course I want to look at their behavior at a very young age, because that's what I'm interested in. But if my research question is in general to find welfare indicators or stress indicators, then I would work with more or less grown-up animals, because that is what we are mainly having on our farms. But it really depends on the research question, I think. I cannot say that there's an age where you should test. No, sorry.
Thanks. So we have a question from Marta. So Marta, also thank you very much for your presentation. And she wants to ask that, Katrina, you mentioned some quantitative valence indicators like heart rate, variability, and alpha amylase in saliva. Do you happen to know more about the research on these indicators? And she thinks that they are not yet, is it true that they are not yet validated for goats? But do you think that they are a promising direction?
Yes, exactly. It's more like suggestions where I think they are promising. However, the saliva one, it is the first one of its, oh, sorry, not the saliva one. What was this? The immuno, I know which one you meant. Actually, no, I don't unfortunately know more on this one, right? The salivary alpha amylase. It's the first one that is working with this kind of parameter, but they found very good, very clear results, let's put it like that. But again, it's the only study I found on that, so I would not call it validated, no, but it looked promising. The only thing I really know more about is cardiography, because also, for example, Jan Langbein, who I'm working with, did a lot of work on dwarf goats using heart rate variability, and there they found good correlations with positive emotional states during cognitive tasks, for example. But I cannot say more, unfortunately, about the other two.
Thanks. Do we have more questions? If you're, as I say, if you're still typing, and please just click raise hand, and we'll wait for you, your question to come in. While we're waiting, I just have one quick question. So you mentioned also about the positive emotional state, and of course, I think QBA will be a good way to really measure that. In terms of physiological indicators, you said that you are more familiar with cardiography. Is there also some study already out about cardiography to measure positive emotional states?
Yes, it is, or more or less, yes, it is, has been used, as I said, in a study on cognitive tests, assessing if goats like cognitive challenge or not. And this study with Jan Langbein actually found that goats during they could see that during anticipation, heart rate and heart rate variability changed, and from that they assumed that this could be a sign for like a positive anticipation, or an indicator that goats actually enjoy cognitive challenge, because at first heart rate went up, but then as the goats got better in the task and got more used, heart rate got down and heart rate variability up. So this is a first indicator for maybe parameter for valence, but again, it's only very limited what we have on research yet. So I think there is still more work to be done to really call them validated. But the vagus nerve is definitely associated, has been associated also in many other species with, well, parasympathetic activity, and showing us that during, also in humans, right, that during digestion, also when we're calm, more relaxed, HRV is high, whereas during stressful situations, HRV is low. This is actually also the case for chronic stress, where we can even see that if stress is long-term stress, chronic stress causes HRV to not really have variability anymore, so low HRV. But again, in animals, or especially goats, it has not been so thoroughly assessed yet. So I wouldn't call it a validated valence indicator yet.
Thanks. So, which means that there's still a lot of different directions we can keep our research.
Oh, absolutely. I think we only know so little, and we also don't know what exactly causes these changes in heart rate, or how many organs even play together. I was just searching literature for this presentation actually, and even found an article suggesting that maybe only norepinephrine is affected by stress, like really bad stress, whereas other corticosteroids are not so much. I found that very interesting. I will look into that more actually, but no, there is unfortunately still so much more work to do.
Yeah, it's a good thing for us researchers. So
Absolutely.
yeah, if there's no more question, then anyway, if you have further questions, we welcome you to come to the Slack workspace. Then we can continue our discussion there. And I want to thank Katrina again for this very interesting talk. So next Monday, the 27th of April, we will have Katrina Rosenberger will talk about individual mobility patterns in laying hands. So do tune in again. And starting in May, we probably will have the webinar every 2 weeks. So it will become every other Monday. And if you're interested in giving your talk, and do feel free to get in touch with us, with me, Christian, Rachel, or Laura, and you can find us on the Slack workspace as well. So this talk will be, it was recorded, and then we will put it on our Slack workspace as well. So you could come back to it later if you missed some details on Katrina's slides. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you all next week. Thanks again, Katrina.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Good evening. Bye.
Good evening. Bye.